Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley, and I am the Strategic Communications Director here for the History Center. I'm also the curator and coordinator of these author talks. We are so thrilled that you're joining us this evening for our talk with Curtis Wilkie in conversation with Hank Klibanoff. And please note that tonight's program is being recorded for C-SPAN and will be broadcast on Book TV at a later time. So we're really excited about that. So during tonight's conversation, Hank and Curtis will be taking your questions. So you can use the Q&A feature to submit those. And there never seems to be quite enough time, so we will get to as many as absolutely possible. So if you would like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, which we highly recommend, you can do that from tonight's official bookseller, Acapella Books. I will be providing a link to do that in the chat. And we encourage you to support your local independent bookstore. And Acapella offers free in-town delivery. So if you're local for Atlanta, look for that. I'm going to briefly introduce tonight's speakers and then turn it over to them. Curtis Wilkie covered civil rights activity in Mississippi in the 1960s and afterwards served as a national and international correspondent for a quarter century at the Boston Globe. He currently lives in Oxford, Mississippi. And of course, he is the author of When Evil Lived in Laurel, The White Knights, and the Murder of Vernon Dame. He's in conversation tonight with Hank Klibanoff. So Hank is a veteran journalist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and a Peabody Award-winning podcast host. He co-authored The Race Beat, The Press, The Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation that won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for History. And he was also a reporter and editor for more than 35 years, holding various reporting and editing positions, including at our hometown Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Hank, Curtis, thank you both so much for being here this evening. We're so looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Claire. I appreciate it. Curtis, it's great to see you.
Me too.
Looking forward to this. Curtis and I go back more. We're not going to do the arithmetic, but we go back a ways, not too far away, but Mississippi days. That was my first reporting job, and that was Curtis's too. But he had already moved out of Mississippi and, was at the Boston Globe when I met him, although I may have met you when you were still with the Delaware paper. I'm not sure. But we both have had a long time interest in Mississippi. For him, it's lifelong because he was from there. People used to say, "Are you from Mississippi, Hank?" I'd say, "Oh gosh, no. Good Lord, no. Mississippi? Are you kidding me?" They'd say, "Oh no, I didn't think you were." And then I'd say, "No, I'm from Alabama." But we were. It was like kinfolk, and Curtis was very important in my life. And he gets embarrassed when I say this to people, but I would never have made it to the Boston Globe if Curtis hadn't put in a word for me at one time. So I've always been grateful for that. And now he's got this just amazing book. It's such an insider story from within the Ku Klux Klan that it's just hard to believe that we're all these years later getting this kind of a narrative from within the Klan. And it's, his name is not on the cover, Tom Landrum, but he is the person who's woven throughout this because he's the one who has the gumption and the courage and the righteousness to become an informer. Can you tell us who Tom Landrum was in this, Curtis?
Well, the story begins in 1965, and Tom Landrum at that time was a 33-year-old youth court counselor in Jones County, Mississippi, which happened to be the headquarters of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And Tom was troubled by the activity in the area, and he was approached by a friend who was a local FBI agent who asked if he would be willing to join the Klan and then become a regular informant to the FBI. And after some soul searching and discussion with his wife and his mother-in-law, he agreed to do so, knowing it was a high risk sort of thing to get involved in. He felt it was something that he needed to do as a citizen of his community. And he did. He joined the White Knights, and for 4 years kept a extensive journal of everything he saw at the meetings. And they contained, they're hundreds of pages, and the Landrum family made that available to me. Descriptions of the meetings, accounts of conversations and quarrels, and it really reflects the dissension and the hatred and the jealousies and the paranoia that existed within the White Knights. And even though I had written about the Klan, and you had too, Hank, it just kind of put me into meetings with these characters, and I learned that there were a bunch of louts and bigots there, but surprisingly, there were publicly elected officials, there were ministers, there were just a diverse group of people, respected businessmen. So it's kind of frightening in a way. Thank God it's been beaten down and run out of the state. But as I just told the people of Laurel, I'm in Laurel tonight, and I spoke there this afternoon. I said, I don't apologize for the title, but I say it's past tense, and you've succeeded in expelling evil from Laurel. So it's an extraordinary thing, Tom Landrum's journals.
He would have been, you got to assume that for every person Bob Ingram approached to do this, he was turned down by many, many more people than took the deal.
And Tom Landrum did take a penny. Some of the Ingram informants, were getting rich informing to the FBI.
But not Tom Landrum.
Not Tom Landrum.
Mm-hmm. And so once he gets in there, I just want to go to a scene there. He goes to his first Klan meeting, and I misinterpreted how he may have felt. But tell us about somebody he ran into when they were frisking him, I guess.
It was a Klansman, and the Klansman was hooded. This was an initiation ceremony. But the guy said to Tom, "Excuse me, coach," as he's frisking him. And Tom realized this was a young man he thought was very promising. Tom had been a coach and a teacher before he became a youth court counselor, and it dismayed him that this fine young man he thought was a member of the Klan. And as he was in, he realized that there were a lot of people that he knew that were there.
Yeah. Actually, I thought it says something about Landrum. I sent you a note and said, gosh, I thought he must have been mortified when the kid saw him, and because Landrum would be ashamed to be considered by this kid to have been considered in the Klan, but you said, actually, no, he was, probably more disappointed and dismayed, like you said, that this kid was in the Klan.
There was one other funny incident from that first encounter with the Klan. They were lined up to new initiation people, and Tom happened to see a relative lined up to join the Klan too, and he thought quickly, and he whispered to one of his Klan helpers, "This boy's married to a Catholic." and so they all freaked out. It was one of many ludicrous scenes involving these people, and they quickly hustled this apostate out of the meeting. How dare a mate of a Catholic, try to penetrate the Klan meeting, and the meeting kind of broke up, and Tom later had to be initiated the next day by the Imperial Wizard Sam Bowers and Devers Nix at John's restaurant. These guys were something.
But so for people who may not know, and we don't know our audience tonight, if we were together at the History Center, we'd see them, we'd have a pretty good sense. But what was Tom Landrum walking into? Aside from the fact that the Klan sometimes could be absurdly ineffective and, walk around with their shoelaces, their two shoes tied together and things. But why did he have good reason to be afraid if he had been afraid?
Well, he was, naturally afraid. Hank, I wouldn't have done it back then had I been asked. And there was then very ample evidence around the same time that they became suspicious. This was the group that was responsible for the Neshoba County murders in 1964. And it was clear that there were informants then that brought about the early arrest in that case. So they knew that there were people inside who were telling tales. And there was a case over in Natchez, or near Natchez. There was another branch of the White Knights. That was the group that morphed into the Silver Dollar Gang. And there was one guy there who was a member of the group, was suspected of being an informant because he had a brother-in-law, I believe, who was a member of the Highway Patrol. And they assumed he was talking to his brother-in-law, and they killed him. Well, Tom had a brother who was on the Highway Patrol, and one of the ranking members of the White Knights. In fact, he was Sam Bauer's really chief lieutenant, the character named Devers Nix. And Devers Nix hated Tom Landrum, period, because Tom's brother had once arrested him. And Devers Nix even called one meeting to try to have Tom expelled from the Klan because of his, relationship with his brother. So, it's very apparent that what might happen to an informant, they would be killed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't mess around, and they were brutal in their killing, and they would, beyond Neshoba County even, although that was certainly probably the most horrific. And I guess that's how they earned their credit within the organization, was by killing. But there were also a lot of big talkers, and probably the more that people talk, the less those people actually did in some cases.
I think that's certainly true. They were, it's just an oddball collection of characters, everything from uneducated, resentful people to people who were in it for fun, looked upon it as a men's club, an excuse to get out of the house at night, and then hardcore people quite capable of going on missions where Black people were killed.
I thought that you captured it so well early on. This page 16. I was going to suggest either you read that or I'll read it. About the fear in Mississippi at the time.
You read it. I don't even have a copy of my book in front of me.
Well, here I'll sell you one. Okay.
The reader's copy to me.
Right. Well, you're talking here about what a horrifying place it was, and Tom Landrum. He was reluctant to speak out against the system. By maintaining the silence, he knew he was abetting an unfavorable international image of white Mississippians as no better than a bunch of ignorant louts and bigots. There seemed little incentive to speak out. The white churches were timorous. The newspapers in the state were mostly supportive of segregation, and politicians who might have been willing to make peace with the federal government had been defeated in the past two statewide elections. Inside white Mississippi, no civic clubs or social organizations dared to question segregation. If one were to raise opposition to the status quo, Tom Landrum saw, it would have to be done privately. Just as you say, a fevered climate of fear. And that's the climate you were raised in. Did you encounter Klansmen what was your...
One of the nastiest places in Mississippi in 1964 was my home county, Pike County. It was known as the church burning capital of the world. There were 25 Black churches that were either burned or bombed that summer because those churches hosted voter registration activity.
And that's where Macomb is, for those who don't know. Yeah. And so they were just they were a permanent presence or a full-time presence in your life, just around. I mean, did your parents talk about people who they knew to be Klansmen? And
happily, I didn't know many people who turned out to be Klansmen. I knew some of the families, but I certainly didn't consort with any people who turned out to be Klansmen, so far as I know. But certainly, like you, we grew up amidst hardcore segregationists, and some of the segregationists, Hank, were smart enough to know that what the Klan was up to was terribly counterproductive to their cause. That it turned off a lot of white people who became troubled by what they were doing, and had a kind of a moral questioning and opposed the Klan and became sympathetic to the movement.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For those, again, who aren't familiar with Sam Bowers, let's just talk a little bit about him. I do a presentation in my civil rights cold cases class, or when I talk about, and I'll show, images of Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and maybe Carlos, and say, we all know these to be terrorists. How about these guys? And my first picture is Sam Bowers smiling with a little pocket handkerchief. And I say to my students, you might think he was a Sunday school teacher. And I told Jerry Mitchell over in Jackson this. Jerry is sort of the head hunter of Klansmen. And Jerry said, Hank, he was a Sunday school teacher.
But he had developed this theology or philosophy he called Christian militancy. And it permitted murder and terrorism in the name of, whatever God they thought they were in cohorts with. It's, fascinating and weird to read and know what Bowers was preaching.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating long series of interviews that were conducted after he had served time in the Neshoba County murders in the 80s, where he talked about this philosophy. And, I guess he preached it to some of his soldiers in the ranks of the White Knights.
Mm-hmm. And
he went on, of course, and continued to, terroristic activities when they were, some of them were arrested, and he was arrested and not convicted at the time of the murder of Vernon Dame. They looked for new targets, and he turned on the Jews in Mississippi, and they began bombing the synagogues in Jackson, Meridian, and the homes of the rabbis and the homes of prominent Jewish businessmen. So he felt that the Jews were, just as much a despicable people as blacks and Catholics too. Catholics bowed to the Pope in Rome, and they didn't deserve to live either. That was his trinity, where the blacks and the Jews and the Catholics, he to dispose of them.
Well, he struck fear, and I know that as a Jewish Southern Jew. one other person I just want to give a quick profile to, and then I want to go into sort of how you got onto this story. And that is Vernon Dame. Tell us about him, because the killing of Vernon Dame becomes so central to this, because it is ultimately the one thing that they're able to pin on Bowers.
Vernon Dahmer is an unsung hero in the civil rights movement. He was known in some Mississippi circles. He was largely confined to South Mississippi, where he was president of the NAACP in Hattiesburg and Forest County, and that was a tough county too. And he was very active in voter registration. He had been purged from the rolls. He had been at one time registered to vote, and they threw him off in a purge in the 40s that got rid of all the black voters. So that became his crusade, and he was very respected in his community and was successful. And he became, as a result, a target of the white knights. Dahmer worked closely with the lawyers in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department in those days leading up to the Voting Rights Act, and then afterwards. That was in mid '65, and so he became the target for the white knights, and they succeeded in killing him in another horrific raid on his own home and his store right outside of Hattiesburg.
He was a man of, just from everything I've ever read, just uncommon decency. And
he was. I wish I'd known him, but he was an ally of my friend Aaron Henry, who was the state president in NAACP, and
right.
I think he was probably a very similar man. Determined to do what he wanted to do, regardless of the threats from the white knights.
So what distinguishes Curtis's book, among so many other things, one, of course, is just a spectacular, experienced writer and knows how to tell a story and how to pull you through. But, he would agree with me, I'm sure, we're only as good as our material when it comes to writing something like this. And you landed this incredible trove of papers from Tom Landrum. How did that come to be?
Tom was identified after all these years, a few years ago, as a member of the Klan in one book that was privately published in local, and hardly anybody saw it, but some people did, and that clearly troubled him by that time. He's in his 80s, and he didn't want that to be part of his legacy, and he had not told his children what had happened, and so they finally had a family conclave, and the children were deeply moved by learning what their dad had done, and they all felt that this needs to be made public. They decided to try to find someone who might tell that story, and happily, it was a series of secretive moves that involved contacts with me, and I didn't know who was contacting me, but assuring me that they had valuable information on the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi in the '60s. And was I interested? Of course I was interested. And so I finally went to Laurel and met with Tom Landrum and his wife, who had been very supportive of him. And
if you don't mind, not just supportive, what did she do every night when he came back from these meetings?
That's the reason we had these papers. She typed the reports to the FBI, and she kept a carbon copy, and she mailed them regularly to her mother in Jackson, and the mother, Tom Landrum's mother-in-law, kept them, put them away in a lockbox. And here, there's this treasure trove of information 50 years later that the Landrums have.
Mm-hmm.
And I might add that it's easily corroborated by a lot of the FBI files at the University of Southern Mississippi Library that I also had access to. I mean, they're there and they're wonderful and were great raw material too. But I could see in some of the reports that this is clearly from Tom Landrum, and I learned what his code name and number was in there. So yeah, it was a daring thing that they did, and they both never knew when the firebomb would come into their house.
And because the Klan was constantly looking for who's leaking. They knew that there were leaks, right? They knew that the FBI was onto them, was already ahead of them, and they were panicked about who was leaking. And
oh yeah, and there were all sorts of suspicions, and at least one guy came up to Tom at one of the meetings and basically threatened him, said, "I know you're one of the rats," and that didn't exactly comfort Tom either.
Mm-hmm. Now that you've sort of been taken into the inner sanctum of the White Knights through Landrum's work, as you were absorbing it and thinking about it and reflecting on it, what do you now realize that you had right, and what did you have wrong about the Klan all these years? What did you learn that may have changed or validated any of your previous knowledge?
Well, I didn't realize that. I knew they had some elected officials. There was one character who ran for governor in Mississippi in 1967 who was the Klan candidate. And he showed up at the Klan meetings, although he denied that he was an actual member. It's a guy named Jimmy Swan, who was a hillbilly singer and had a radio station in down around Laurel or Hattiesburg. Yeah, so I knew there were people like that. But I didn't realize, they had circuit clerks, the people who register voters, and provide the jury list that they were Klan members. And of course, any of the trials that came up in state courts, the circuit clerks were able to solve the juries with a Klansman. That's why we had so many of the hung juries during that period. I guess the other thing that surprised me, certainly it was full of the just plain old down and dirty people, uneducated, racist, mean-spirited. But I had no idea they were such a bunch of incompetent fools, and some of the things that they tried to do, they botched up virtually every operation. They might ultimately succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But the classic was the raid on the Damer home. They came in 2 cars. There were 4 people in each car, and they were armed with shotguns and pistols and jugs of gasoline to start the fires. And there was one guy riding in the car that attacked the Damer home who loved cowboy movies, and he had styled himself a quick draw holster, and he had his pistol in the quick draw holster. And of course, it spilled out during the fracas, and then the 2 cars are leaving, and one of the characters in the car that raided the Damer home thought the other car involved the police, even though they knew they were traveling in tandem. And so his name was Lightning Smith, and Lightning Smith shot out the tires of the other car. So they have to abandon it. It would be highly comic, were it not tragic.
It was.
So they had to abandon the car. And so 8 of these burly Klansmen pile into the last car, the remaining car, and go limping back to Laurel. And on the way, a fellow named Billy Roy Pitts, and the holster maker, says, "Fellas, we got to go back. I dropped my pistol." So you can imagine how that was received. And they're all cursing and screaming. And anyway, that was the evidence that led quickly to the arrest of virtually all the people who were involved.
Well, that even makes the killing of,
like that.
it makes their success, so to speak, in killing Damer all that more tragic, that they were so incompetent at everything else, but they, in their mind, they succeeded at the one thing they wanted, which is just.
It also led to quickly to not only the arrest, but because Damer was such a popular man, that didn't help their cause at all.
Right.
Just angered so many people, white and black, in that area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have a question here. What are the story's lessons for today, especially for the young who will be forming lifelong attitudes and practices?
Yeah, I would say never drop your vigilance. There's still plenty of people filled with racial hatred. It's funny when I started on this project, two things afterwards became current news again. That was, the racial discord and the hatred, but also secondly, the drive to, again, suppress the black vote that's going on now nationwide, to impose all sorts of restrictions to make it more difficult to vote in America. And this is what Vernon Dame died for.
Mm-hmm. When I asked that, and you said, well, never drop your, and you said vigilance, but I thought you were going to say the lesson is never drop your gun. At the scene of the crime. That too. Yeah. But all right, so you were working on this book during the previous administration, Charlottesville, the rise of worldwide nationalism, domestic militia. So having re-immersed yourself in the Klan activities and its personalities, I'd be curious sort of what that was leading you to think when you would see parallels to today's right-wing groups.
Well, it's troubling, Hank. You and I have seen so much progress in the South from that period in the 60s, which was a terribly troubled time and not a happy time. I don't want to go back there. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, all this is going on again. And, it's sad. In some ways, I think that so much of the progress that we saw up until a few years ago, we're regressing. Mm-hmm. Some of the, certainly some of the policies that are being enacted in my state of Mississippi, the refusal to accept Medicaid expansion, and the state is throwing away the chance to have more than $2 billion a year for Medicaid. And clearly it's aimed at blacks. Mm-hmm. The voting restrictions, they're things that seem, they single out blacks to try to drive them out of the state. And not only are they driving blacks out of the state, they're driving, this generation of promising young people. The students that I've been teaching at Ole Miss and people who teach at Emory, Hank, our problem in Mississippi is the brain drain.
I did not realize that there was that going on right now, this out migration.
It's significant and it's very sad. Mississippi was one of 3 states that actually lost population between the censuses. Mm-hmm. And these are good people we're losing. They're young people. They are leaving in droves. And, the state elected officials and, the legislature, the policymakers, they don't care. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're going back to the days of Ross Barnett and George Wallace.
Mm-hmm. They're just short-sighted, you're saying. I mean, it's just because you couldn't look at the numbers and you couldn't look at the future and not see the damage that it will cause long-term. So
it's willful. They know what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay.
they're at it.
Here's a happier question that I think you'll want to answer. Were there many Atticus Finch types, or was that just in the Harper Lee novel? And I think this question would apply to people you've known your lifetime in Mississippi.
They've always been good people in Mississippi. Some of them are lawyers, and some who stood up. And, of course, the name of William Winter comes to mind right away. Hank in Mississippi, who somehow got elected governor in the early 80s. And people still remember him very fondly. But there are a lot of people. I said in my talk here in Laurel today that okay, evil is in my title, but I also have an epigraph. It's the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And there were good people who took these characters on, not only into courtrooms, but in any way they could, whether it was to join the Klan in order to report on them or to try to do it politically, but you're outnumbered down here. But there've always been good people and good white people in Mississippi, good blacks. We've been stereotyped as being, nothing but a bunch of bigots who live here, and we're rightly resentful. I first acknowledge we got plenty of them, got far too many of them back then and today. But there are Atticus Finches, and they're heroes.
My first governor, when I arrived in the state capitol covering the government and legislature and all for the Gulf Coast papers, the Daily Herald, that's before the South Mississippi Sun had started, but the Daily Herald and then the Greenville Delta Democrat Times, was William Waller. And he succeeded John Bell Williams. And John Bell Williams was a real throwback, obviously. He was hardcore white supremacist and not, if I recall, a particularly likable fellow. And Bill Waller was elected, I think it's important to note, even though he was the person who twice prosecuted Byron Dillon Beckwith for killing Medgar Evers.
And that's why he wound up doing well politically. By that time, there were many blacks who were able to vote. Waller was elected, was 73, 71?
71, yeah.
And so 6 years after the Voting Rights Act. But he had courageously, in the courtroom in Jackson in 63 or 64, after the Medgar Evers murder, did his damnedest to convict DeLay Beckwith, and it took another 32 years to finally convict that old buzzard. But Waller, I liked Waller. I was gone from the state by that time, but I liked Bill Waller.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah, I liked him enough that, but the thing that's important to say is that by not losing those first two trials, by not having Beckwith acquitted, by building such a case that he at least got a hung jury out of it, that preserved the opportunity to try Beckwith all those years later and not face the double jeopardy thing. So it's one of those times where a hung jury was historically a significant victory.
Yeah, I kind of cherry pick cases, and people like you and Jerry Mitchell covered day in, day out so much of this period. But I was there for the Beckwith trial, and I still think it's one of the more dramatic moments of my journalistic career, simply to be in that courtroom when they came in with the guilty verdict in 94, and then 4 years later to be in the courtroom in Hattiesburg when they came in with the guilty verdict for Sam Bowers for the murder of Vernon Dame,
Mhm.
and packed him off to jail where he spent the rest of his life.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I got goosebumps.
I would think. I mean, you would watch the whole turn of the tide, and with whether it was a good explanation or not, whether it lasted or not. You know that I have this question that I don't want to belabor and steal thunder from the people who have questions, but I still am befuddled that in the South, around the time Waller's elected, 71, and Jimmy Carter's elected, and over, in that kind of period of time, you have Reuben Askew down in Florida, and you have Dale Bumpers and David Pryor over in Arkansas, and Dolph Briscoe, and I just, and I don't, and there was this moment, it seemed like, of 3 to 5 years or 6 years when some very enlightened, progressive white Democrats held governor's offices in the South, and then it's gone. Do you have any idea why the Democrats couldn't hold on to that?
Well, clearly, the Republicans, they had a smarter political strategy, and it's embodied basically in the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, and they became, they converted all the old conservative Democrats, and the National Democratic Party, on the one hand, was quite liberal and progressive and pro-civil rights. And these governors that you talked about, who were they were in concert with the National Party. They became very unpopular in their home states because the National Democrats were very quickly demonized as leftist and liberal.
Overnights and right.
Liberal became an ugly word, and as a result, there are not a hell of a lot of Democrats elected in the South these days, and it was smart politics, but kind of immoral ones too.
Mm-hmm.
And all the Jim Eastland, John Stennis, George Wallace people, they all became Republicans.
Right. As did the Richard Russell people here. Right. Okay. I have a question. It sort of it takes off where my last one left off, which I'm glad to see. How would you compare the motivations and backgrounds and beliefs of the people who joined the Klan back in the 60s and those who now join white supremacist groups like Proud Boys, Three Percenters, etc.? If there are people who feel left out, resentful of others like black and brown people, Jews, what can be done to help them see a path to their success that does not involve hatred and persecution? That's two separate questions. Just let's go with the first one. Do you see parallels in these attitudes? Did that attitude of the Klan just never go away?
No, it didn't. It's always been there. I mean, you and I think at times encouraged by the progress that we saw from the days in the 60s. Which is a really terrible time and a frightening time. So we don't see the Ku Klux Klan bombing houses and burning down homes, but that attitude exists. It never went away, and certainly you see it now in these far right nationalistic groups. It's they don't like the other. It's somebody other than your pure Anglo-Saxon white Protestant, and it's sad, but they are it's all kind of directly descended from the people we saw in the 60s.
Yeah, they didn't go away. Yeah. Even though they, were driven out of business, like over in Alabama, what Morris Dees did, driving, them out of business. But that was not.
Morris Dees could, cause them to go bankrupt effectively put an end to them, or the principal people could get arrested. But that doesn't eliminate that
attitude.
that hatred that
Right.
some people
Right.
continue to carry.
I have a question here that it takes us back to Laurel, and it actually, I'm glad to see it takes us back to the Klan meetings, because they're, your descriptions of these meetings are so wonderful, not just because of the fear that a Landrum might have had, but just the constant arguing and the constant quarreling and the sort of the inane arguments that some people were making on let's just go bomb them, let's just go burn their houses, let's go out there now, and the impulses that were sort of catalytic in the room, and the fact that many of these guys were all ratting out on each other, but the question is sort of what were all those disputes about? Why was there internecine warfare within the Klan?
A lot of it is petty stuff, and someone wanted to be more prominent in the organization. There was one guy who's compared his position to that of J. Edgar Hoover because he was the director of the Klan Bureau of Investigation, which probably didn't even exist, but they squabbled. Probably a lot of alcohol probably was involved in some of these discussions, and but they might go out on a mission to burn down or bomb a house, and they would just decide arbitrarily, we haven't used up all our gasoline, let's go pick another house and burn it. It was mindless, some of the stuff these people did. There was one poor guy that was a black guy, they blamed on following in a car two white school teachers, and they made all these plans to capture him and lash him with Black Annie, the bullwhip, and the guy had done nothing. He just happened to be driving on the same road with these people. There's a lot of mindless activity.
Yeah.
And you get a bunch of guys together. It's like a Southern redneck beer joint or something. Invariably they're going to wind up in fist fights.
Yeah. I think Landrum or somebody was constantly surprised by going to meetings and see some people there were already pretty tanked. I mean, they were pretty.
Yeah, and when they tanked, they talked loudly and belligerently, and sometimes it wasn't confined to the Klan meetings. They had a couple of favorite hangouts in Laurel where they would boast about after the raid. They'd go there and drink some more and talk about we did a good job last night on the house.
Yeah. I also want to go back on one other question, because I'm thinking about when there was a question about were there any Atticus Finches and all, and just in your own story here, there were two I pulled out. There were more than two, but that you make reference, even though he was not a Mississippian, to Charles Weltner. I mean, he was our congressman here in Atlanta. He was in this district that later became John Lewis's district, and I think the only Southern congressman to vote for the Civil Rights Act, the Deep South congressman. And then can we talk a little bit about Charles Pickering,
Sure.
who I know you know very well, and I got to know when I covered him in the legislature.
Pickering is a character in the book, and I knew Judge Pickering before I took up this project, and he was very helpful because he had been the county prosecuting attorney at that time. He was the guy trying to put away these people, and Tom Landrum, he was a friend of Tom Landrum's, and Landrum would hear threats about Pickering when they were going to go burn down his home because of his activities as a prosecuting attorney. So, Charles Pickering is a good example of a good man. And happy to say that I'm having dinner with Judge Pickering right after this program's over. So I'll tell him that his name was in the lights tonight.
Right, right. Well, I knew State Senator Pickering at the time when I covered the legislature. And I will say this, he was, I guess, was he appointed by President George Bush, W. Bush?
Yeah.
Yeah, to be a federal judge. And then, or maybe it was HW paid him federal judge, then W wanted to promote to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans. And I shouldn't call him Charles, but I always sort of did. It was very conservative on a number of issues. I mean, most issues, and certainly much down the Republican line of the Republicans of the 70s and 80s. But the one thing that distinguished him was on matters of race and things like public schools. I always was marveling that Charles Pickering sent I believe every single one of his 5 or 6 children to the Laurel public schools. He didn't, take them out and put them in the white segregationist academies. And yet when the second Bush names him to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, there's this huge outcry among certain liberal groups that he was too conservative, but they would always throw in, and he's a racist, which I personally knew to be untrue.
It's very unfair. He was a victim there, and he believes the opposition was largely because he was an opponent of abortion rights, but to use the idea that this good man in the fight against the Klan and in support of Black voting rights and that matter, to cast him as a racist was terribly unfair. And I know the first time I met him was on the Ole Miss campus about 20 years ago when the fight was going on, and he was with William Winter, certainly a progressive Democrat, and William Winter was vouching for him and prepared to testify for him, and as were other Democrats in Mississippi who had appreciated the work he had done, and it didn't do any good in Washington. George W. finally had to use a recess appointment to get him a seat on the Fifth Circuit for a year.
Yeah, I was at, relatively new managing editor here at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I asked 2 reporters to go over there and check his record, because I was prepared to find out that I was wrong, that he had a, hidden, racist judicial record or whatever, but I wasn't wrong.
We get branded if we're from Mississippi or Alabama.
Yeah. Okay, there's another question. Did you see in your research much about Robert Moses as being a target of the Klan, or maybe from your Macomb and Pike County days where?
Bob Moses was very much a target. I'm not sure that Moses is in my book because there's very little about Pike County and Amite County where he was, where he gained renown in his work in the early days of the movement in Mississippi. William Moses was beaten up by Klansmen in the streets of Macomb and threatened and I think beaten in neighboring Amite County. No question, Moses was a target of the Klan, and because of his good work.
So I'm going to tell our audience that we're closing in here. If anyone has a question they wanted to ask, there's one about Vernon Dame, but we've already answered it. Here's one that it would take. It's a little speculative, but maybe not. I mean, it wants top 5 reasons for one thing, and top 3 for another. But just what would be reasons that people wanted to join the Klan, and what would be reasons that people didn't stand up to them? I mean, fear obviously would be a reason people wouldn't. But what was the Klan? Was it just because it was clannish? And I mean,
no, it certainly was, but they were, I talked about this briefly earlier. There are various reasons why people wound up joining, and some of them they felt it was sort of like joining the American Legion or the Masons, and the secret ceremony maybe was appealing, and they worshipped the Confederacy, and the Confederate battle flag was a symbol that was used in their ceremony. Diehard neo-Confederates would be attracted to them. Some people kind of looking for a good time, get together with the fellows and go to the woods, these secret meetings.
blow up stumps.
Yeah, and so that was the appeal, and then clearly. So much of it was driven by people who were, racist and felt that the Klan was the last bulwark against the terrible forces of civil rights, and so they felt allied to the Klan. It was, and some were cold-hearted, cold-blooded killers. And some were ministers. Some were persuaded that the Bible legitimized all this stuff, and they would cite various scripture. Constantly turned to Romans. Was the Bible used in the ceremonies was usually turned to the book of Romans, and I'm not a biblical scholar by any means, but I kind of browsed through it, and damned if I could see much rationale for joining the Klan there in Romans. Just a curious motley group of people.
Motley group of people, but as you know, there's plenty written, whether it's The Mind of the South by Bill Cash, or Cast by Dollard, Class and Cast, and I forget the name. And there's a lot written about the poor, disaffected white Southerner who can sometimes be led into almost a Kafkaesque clannish type of behavior by being convinced that there are other people out there threatening them and want to take their jobs, want to take their wives, want to take their daughters. And usually, who was that going to be? It was going to be, Black people. And it was a fevered type of thing. You use that word in there. And I just think that's exactly what it was. It was a mania.
Yeah. No, absolutely. They too were driven by fear, as well as hatred, and the fear that the fear of losing jobs. That the Black man's actually got a salary better than they do, maybe, or a Black family may appear more comfortable than their family. And very resentful, and a lack of education is part of it too. So it was it's kind of a witch's brew.
One of our members of the audience says some people were no doubt bullied into joining too, and I'm sure that's very much the case. Maybe not, and some people didn't stay for long. They were in, they were out, but.
Yeah, there were people who joined and then saw the error of their ways and got out, sometimes at their peril, because then, the Klan may think, well, he was one of the informants. And I don't know of any specific cases where, there was retaliation, physical, but, it was a tough thing to do, to go in and, be initiated into secret ceremony and then renounce it. But some people did, and some of them were troubled by the violence. They didn't get into it, to go kill somebody. So it was different reasons.
But was this a hard book to write?
Not really. It was challenging, but I enjoyed it, Hank. I enjoyed getting to know Tom Landrum. I knew him for the last year and a half of his life. Tom died just before Christmas in 2019. And, the Landrum family has been so helpful to me in developing this, and so many other people. It was, it's like, you've written books, and okay, it's maybe not the easiest thing in the world to sit down on a laptop these days and write, but I truly enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, this is what, your sixth? How many books have you written?
Six and maybe last. I'd said that about the last one too.
I hope not, but you've had to write about people you felt emotionally had been friends. Dickie Scruggs, that was hard to do, right? I mean, to write about.
Yeah, that was probably in many ways the most challenging book that I did, and involved, probably tougher reporting than I was ever engaged in for that one. But in the end, I enjoyed it too.
Well, the one I want to give a plug to, other than this one, is your book called Dixie, which is a terrific book, and it had the terrible misfortune of coming out, am I correct, on September 11th?
Yeah, it sure did. It's kind of like all the people who had books coming out at the start of the COVID pandemic.
Right.
And here we're still kind of stuck with, we're not able to do a lot of these things in person. You and I both lamented that we couldn't get together with a regular audience. But I have a good excuse for very poor sales for Dixie.
Well, I want to boost your sales tonight because I thought it was terrific.
Yeah.
So, Curtis, anything else you want to add that you think?
It's good to see you, if I can say that.
Yeah.
Again, I hope to see you in person before long. And thank you to the Atlanta History Center for giving me this time.
Very good, Claire. Thank you. Thanks to Sheffield Hale. Appreciate the Atlanta History Center on this, and our terrific audience. We had a really nice turnout, so that's great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hank and Curtis. It was an absolutely just fascinating conversation. And if you don't have your copy of the book yet, never fear. You can buy it tonight from Acapella Books. I put that link to do it in the chat. Absolutely wonderful book. We highly encourage you to purchase it and support Curtis during this time of weird virtual tours and book launches. So we so appreciate all of you for being with us tonight virtually. I hope that we're going to be back together in person really, really soon. It's looking better as we go. So Curtis and Hank, thank you so much. And for everyone in the audience, if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, we have a lot of virtual events coming up, particularly related to the Juneteenth holiday that's coming up this weekend. So we have two great conversations next week. The first is a panel, and it includes Steve Pfeiffer, Al Vivian, and Ambassador Andrew Young in conversation with Ernie Suggs, and they will be discussing C.T. Vivian's posthumously published memoir, It's in the Action. So it's going to be a really great discussion Monday night at 6:30, pre-registration. You can find it on our website. And then on Wednesday, we will be welcoming Adrian Miller to discuss his new book, Black Smoke, African Americans in the United States of Barbecue. So make sure you grab your barbecue before you watch that talk. She'll be very hungry afterwards. So thank you again so much, everyone. Have a wonderful Juneteenth holiday weekend, and we hope to see you back here real soon.